Don't often do this, but I thought it would be interesting to read a little extract from a book that I quoted in a previous video, the video on my take on the British Empire. Unfortunately, with those sort of videos, there's always people who are a little bit reactionary and don't watch. And a few people were portraying my stance as just looking at the positive or trying to present the empire somehow good. So, just to reiterate my stance on this, I've never argued that empire was good. Very clearly, all empires were about exploitation and conquest and self-interest. That's just a fact. And I've never argued to the contrary. Rather, what I do argue is after the fact, the whole picture needs to be looked at. And like I say, there's two extremes positions. There's one which sort of vilifies the imperial power, in this case the British, and says it was all evil and murder and slaughter and exploitation. That was it. And that's short-sighted because we would not have had the control that we had for 250 years, for example, in India, had we just gone in and killed everyone. It just wouldn't have worked that way. But then there is the other side, which downplays the very wrong things that were done. Um, I'm just going to read out an extract from the book by Niall Ferguson, which was partly influenced me to make that video. Empire, published 2003. Now, this particular segment is dealing with Tory Orientalism, sort of the high empire circa late 19th century, and specifically um, the balance sheet, so to speak. Because often people talk about, I've heard people talk about the British making reparations for empire. This section sort of deals with that a little bit, not the reparations issue, but the balance sheet. So here we go. This is abridged. I'm not reading out the whole chapter for space reasons, but just give you an idea. Um, the supreme irony was that this architectural extravagance, he's referring to the Viceroy's palace in New Delhi, was paid for by none other than the Indian taxpayer. Daily before they earned their liberty, the Indians would have to go on paying for the privilege of being ruled by the British. There's obvious sarcasm there. Was it a privilege worth paying for? The British took it for granted that it was, but even Curzon himself, this is Lord Curzon, who is often attached with that period, once admitted that British rule may be good for us, but it is neither equally nor altogether good for them. Indian nationalists agreed wholeheartedly, complaining that the wealth of India was being drained into the pockets of foreigners. In fact, we now know that this drain, the colonial burden as measured by the trade surplus of the colony, amounted to little more than 1% of the Indian net domestic product a year between 1868 and 1930, in other words, the height of empire. That was a lot less than the Dutch drain from the East Indies Empire, which amounted to between 7 and 10% of Indonesian net domestic product in the same period. I'll continue in a minute, but if you listen to Indian nationalists today, the narrative is the British just stole everything from India. It's not that simple. Roughly 1%, if Ferguson's figures are correct. And on the other side of the balance sheet was the immense British investments in Indian infrastructure, irrigation and industry. By the 1880s, the British had invested £270 million in India. This isn't inflated, this is actual terms. Not much less than one-fifth of their entire investment overseas. By 1914, the figure had reached 400 million. The British increased the area of irrigated land by a factor of 8, so that by the end of the Raj, a quarter of all land was irrigated, compared with just 5% of it under the Mughals. They created an Indian coal industry from scratch, which by 1914 produced nearly 16 million tonnes a year. They increased the number of jute spindles by a factor of 10. There were also marked improvements in public health, which increased Indian life expectancy by 11 years. It was the British who introduced quinine as an anti-malarial prophylactic, carried out public programs of vaccination against smallpox, often in the face of local resistance, and laboured to improve the urban water supplies, which were so often the bearers of cholera and other diseases. And although it is simply impossible to quantify, it is hard to believe that there were not some advantages in being governed by as incorruptible a bureaucracy as the Indian civil service. After independence, that idiosyncratic Anglophile, Chowdhury, was sacked from All India Radio for dedicating his autobiography of an unknown Indian to the memory of the British Empire in India, because all that was good in living within us was made shaped and quickened by the same British Empire. That was willful overstatement, but it had a grain of truth, which is of course why it so outraged Chowdhury's nationalist critics. True, the average Indian had not got much richer under British rule. Between 1757 and 1947, British per capita gross domestic product increased in real terms by 347%, Indian by a mere 14%, so it clearly wasn't balanced to the mother country. A substantial share of the profits which accrued as the Indian economy industrialised went to British managing agencies, banks or shareholders, this despite the fact that there was no shortage of capable Indian investors and entrepreneurs. This was one of the big mistakes of empire, of course. Um, and probably racism was a factor in that, not wanting to trust it with natives. The free trade imposed on India in the 19th century exposed indigenous manufacturers to lethal European competition at a time when the independent United States of America sheltered its infant industries behind high tariff walls. In 1896, Indian mills supplied just 8% of Indian cloth consumption. It should also be remembered that Indian indentured labourers supplied much of the cheap labour on which later British imperial economy depended. Between the 1820s and the 1920s, close to 1.6 million Indians left India to work in a variety of Caribbean, African, Indian Ocean, and Pacific colonies, ranging from the rubber plantations in Malaya to the sugar mills of Fiji. Conditions in which they travelled and worked were often little better than those that had been inflicted on African slaves a century before, nor could the best efforts of civil servants like McConaughey, that's Machonochie, avert terrible famines in 1876 to 1878 and 1899 to 1900. Indeed, in the former, the British predilection for laissez-faire economics actually made matters worse. But would Indians have been better under the Mughals, or for that matter, under the Dutch or the Russians? It might seem self-evident that they would have been better off under Indian rulers. That was certainly true from the point of view of the ruling elites the British had overthrown, and whose share of national income this is the Mughals it's referring to, um, something like 5%, then appropriate for their own consumption. But for the majority of Indians, it was far less clear that their lot would improve under independence. Under British rule, the village economy's share of total after-tax income actually rose from 45% to 54%. Since that sector represented around three-quarters of the entire population, there can therefore be little doubt that British rule reduced inequality in India by improving the lot of rural peasants. Um, and even if the British did not generally increase Indian incomes, things might conceivably have been worse under a restored Mughal regime had the mutiny succeeded. China did not prosper under Chinese rulers. The reality then was that Indian nationalism was fueled not by the impoverishment of the many, but by the rejection of the privileged few. In the age of Macaulay, the British had called into being an English-speaking, English-educated elite of Indians, a class of civil service auxiliaries on whom their system of administration had come to depend. In time, these people naturally aspired to have some share in the government of the country, just as Macaulay had predicted. But in the age of Curzon, this is high empire, they were spurned in favour of a decorative but largely defunct Maharajas, who were absolutely not personifiable to the average Indian. Right, so the point of this is firstly, claims that Ferguson is some sort of apologist for empire is simply false. He's clearly shown the negative side as well. But I think it's quite obvious from that on balance, the investments into India arguably outweighed that which was taken out of India, or at least it wasn't a black and white situation that the British simply went in, took everything, killed everyone. It's just that's why I reject that version of history because it doesn't really help anyone. All it does is stir up Anglophobic resentment, even today, um, and it's simply not showing the whole picture. Now, it's true that in that period that life expectancy increased, the same is true in Britain itself, but the reality is it wasn't all a bad picture for Indians under British rule. It just wasn't. Uh, in my other video, some people pointed out beneath, and the the principle of empire cannot be justified. Well, I agree. Again, I reiterate, empire was self-interested. It was exploitative course it was. Every empire had that goal. Um, but today we sometimes hear calls for, Britain should pay India back for the empire. Well, the investments that we put in, the infrastructure. I mean, if we were to pay India back, or if we were to, retract what we put in, put it that way, we'd have to uproot pretty much the whole of Indian railways, or a good chunk of it, which were built on British rule. I'm not going to say by the British. A lot of them would have been Indian labourers, but it was the British colonial government that organised this. That's the reality. And that isn't defence of empire, it's just pointing out one part of it. Would anyone want to return to the brutal practice of sati, in which an Indian widow was burned alive with her husband? I mean, that's something the British abolished. Would anyone argue that was a good thing? Um, all I am saying is that when it comes to empire, there has to be a balanced assessment after the fact. I think assessments that say, oh, the British were evil and wrong and it was all terrible is false. Just as it's false to say that there weren't terrible things that happened, like the Amritsar massacre. One thing, though, about the famine, so just briefly touch on this. I've heard Indian nationalists claiming that was genocide. That's a very contentious claim because the purpose of genocide, explicitly in legal terms, is to eradicate an entire people or a culture. Now, you have a devastating famine. Um, to claim it as genocide has to be shown that there is a genocidal intent as a matter of policy. In the Second World War, the Bengal famine, which was a major famine, I believe about 3 million died. The fact was it was in the context of a world war where resources were being stretched across the world, in troop numbers and so on, troop supplies. The idea that the British somehow deliberately caused famines to kill off Indians is nonsensical because we needed Indians, to build things and to be part of that colonial bureaucracy. So it's nonsensical that there was some sort of genocidal policy. It was a terrible, terrible thing. But I think any claims that it was a genocidal policy need to be heavily scrutinised. I do think in India today, unfortunately, there is a component fueled by Modiism um, that kind of breeds Anglophobia. I've seen this on We On News, Gravitas. It's this sort of Anglophobic resentment, and that's curious because India, in many ways, is a successful country today. It surpassed the UK in GDP. It's fifth, we're now sixth. It's got its own space program. Many have been lifted out of poverty, though not enough. But India is a powerful, successful country in many ways. So I don't really see the point of having resentment towards a former colonial power now 76 years ago. So and as a Briton, naturally I am not going to be okay with my country just being outright vilified. I would say this, when you look at other examples of hegemony, I wonder do Italians feel guilty about the might of the Roman Empire? We know the Romans were bloodthirsty, some of the awful things they done. Are modern Mongolians, do they feel guilty about the carnage done in the name of Genghis Khan? What I'm questioning is why should European powers feel explicitly guilty? Indeed, Indians themselves. Is there any guilt over the Mughals? Well, with that, of course, there's Islamic influence. Now, with Hindu nationalists like Modi, there is now some revisionism going on there and some, let's say, anti-Islamic sentiments. I think it's fair to say, though, that there is a dark side to the Mughal conquest of India. Millions died. But the point I'm making here is why is it that the British are expected to feel guilty about basically the fact that we were the superpower, we were the most powerful country in the world? I defy any nationalist in India or anywhere else to not have some national pride if their country was at the top. Of course they would. Um, that's just human nature. So anyway, I thought that segment was very important. This book is not an apology of empire, rather it's presenting, I think, a pretty balanced account. There's other accounts on the empire that have been done more recently that I think are overtly negative and therefore not showing the whole picture.